Take my hand. I'll lead you into death. By a Whisper in the Shadows, on AO3. Episode 17. Chapter 10. Shouta was tired. There was really no other way he could describe the last few days other than tiring. His body was tired. His head was tired. His emotions were fucking exhausted. All he wanted to do was curl up in his sleeping bag with his family and their cats and sleep for a goddamn year. Alas, that was not going to happen. Midoriya had been in the hospital for 3 days and was being released into Shouta and Hisashi's care that evening. There had been plenty of long and exhausting meetings and phone calls made the last few days to work out Midoriya's situation. When the rat had called him after Midoriya woke up in the hospital, Shouta knew he had to prepare himself for either very good news or the worst news ever. In this case, it was neither. Nezu had a sympathy towards the boy that Shouta couldn't fully wrap his head around. Caged animals will always find hilarity in each other, was all he had to say. In any case, Nezu had proposed an idea to both him and the commission. Shouta will never understand how the rat knows things and works so fast. One that would benefit both Midoriya and the Hero Society, or so he said. He proposed that Midoriya reside with Shouta himself for the time being, before being transferred to the student dormitories. Midoriya would be brought back into society through the hero course, and use what he learned to their own advantages. Shouta understood why Nezu had suggested this plan of action. He knew if they let Midoriya to the commission, to those who had been on his case long before Shouta even heard of the boy, he would be turned into a soldier. He would be used for the commission's dirty work, pushed through the system worse than hawks, and when he wasn't needed, he would be shoved into the pit of the darkest cell or lab room. At least with Nezu's plan, he had a chance to live again. Shouta understood this. That didn't mean he had to like it. First, there was the issue of his family. Though Rogue had never killed a child before, they had killed plenty of teenagers and young adults. Not only would he be putting his family at risk, but also his students. He felt an intense guilt whenever those thoughts came to his mind, but Midoriya was still an unknown. For all they know, this was all an act, and Shouta hated that he thought like that. But his excuse was that it was his hero in him. In reality, he was just fucking terrified of what he didn't know. In reality, it wasn't the hero, but the human in him. Though he had his concerns, he still obeyed, knowing that this was the best course of action for both Midoriya and for figuring out Reaper's bigger picture. They needed to gain Midoriya's trust just as much as they needed him to trust the boy himself. So, after hours and hours of deliberation, the commission had been pursued to allow Nezu taking in the boy under the school's wing, provided he followed a number of rules. With the commission's rules, Yue's rules, and Shouta's own rules, going through all of them was going to be a huge headache. Explaining the situation to his family and then students was the next issue. Shouta had to deal with over those few days. Hizashi was wary, of course, but like the loving, wonderful, perfect human he is, it didn't take much to convincing. Even if he hadn't seen the boy since the interrogation room, there were a number of issues they both had to discuss in more detail. But overall, he seemed more at ease with Midoriya being their temporary ward than Shouta did. Hitoshi was more difficult to convince. He was furious Shouta even allowed Nezu to consider Midoriya living with them. Of course, Hitoshi only knew him as Reaper, had yet to formally be introduced to Midoriya himself. Like always, however, the anger was having the young boy's true feeling. He was terrified. Terrifying of losing the one true family he had, the only true friend he had. When Shouta left their house a number of hours earlier, he still hadn't come around. It was going to be tough getting Hitoshi on board, to feel about Midoriya at least a little bit how Shouta did, to try and understand. He knew it was hard enough, knew that losing fears weren't going to disappear overnight. Next were his students. Obviously they knew something big was going on. They sometimes act like idiots, but they weren't stupid. They connected the dots. They knew the reason Shouta and Bakugou seemed to keep disappearing from school was because of the Reaper case. Shouta couldn't tell them everything, so all they understood is that a new student would be joining them. Again, they aren't stupid. Shouta knows that they know it's Reaper. Shouta knows that they're going to be just as paranoid, just as wary as the sun, especially considering all they had faced in the last year. They had questions, of course. Lots and lots of questions. for both him and Bakugou, and really anyone they could get their hands on. Shouta had ordered them to not leave the school until he was back, had ordered them not to bother himself, his husband, or Bakugou and Hitoshi with questions, had ordered the two boys not to answer any. He rarely gave instructions and orders so intently, but this was a situation they needed to be patient in, whether they liked it or not. When he told Bakugou about the plan, he was instantly on board. He didn't care what he had to do. He would help Midoriya. Shouta had to sit him down and have a very long and hard conversation about how Midoriya wasn't who he remembered him to be, at least not fully. He knew Bakugou didn't take in fully what he was saying, blinded by having his friend back. But again, Shouta knew his student was no fool. Shouta knew that if he thought prison was Midoriya's best opinion, he would agree, even if it was after a screaming defense. Part of Shouta was glad Midoriya had at least one person fully in his corner. He just hoped that wouldn't come back to bite him in the ass later on. Bakugou's conversation then led him to the longest and hardest. All parents were to be informed. Not of Reaper's status, or much of his case, due to confidentiality and their own safety. It was still essential that UA inform them of a potential dangerous ward that would be inhabitable through the school. Though they were wary, they had come to trust the school and their own children as they began to understand. This was their lives now. This was what being a hero meant. They would always be in the element of danger that came with the job. So once all the parents were informed, Shouta was forced to move on to the larger part of the job, informing the Bakugous that the assassin that was once out to kill their son was actually his presumed dead childhood friend and would now be living with him. It went surprisingly a lot better than Shouta expected. Though in hindsight, the Bakugous had always had a trust in Shouta and their son to do what was right and keep everyone safe. Informing Midoriya Inko that her son was still alive and now was one of the world's most feared assassins? Much harder. Shouta was fortunate he didn't have to deal with that too much. As of yet, sitting in the hospital room, waiting for her arrival, however, Shouta had never felt so nervous. Even Tsukachi couldn't comprehend how Miss Midoriya would feel, so Shouta had no idea what to expect. He was essentially taking her son away from her again. He really hoped she hadn't requested to see the boy so that she could try bringing him home, because for her own safety, and Izuku's safety, they wouldn't be able to permit it. The boy in question seemed oblivious to Shota's concerns as he sat on the windowsill, staring out at the city. The sun was beginning to set, parting the room in pretty orange and pinks. Midoriya was a lot smaller than Shouta had initially realized, and now looked like he was drowning in the tracksuit he brought him. He was shorter than Reaper seemed, Reaper's boots having slight platforms on them for hiding weapons. He was skinnier, without all the armor as well, but still looked strong. Even so, it looked as though the kid hadn't gotten a good meal in a long while. Hizashi was going to love the shopping element of this caretaking. Shouta furrowed his brows slightly, preparing to ask just when Midoriya had a full meal last, but the hospital door slammed open. Shouta glared at Bakugou, who was glaring at his phone, muttering something about shitty extras for not minding their business. Shouta turned to watch Midoriya as the green-haired boy observed Bakugou, eyeing his movements carefully. Though still wary, it was clear Midoriya had a connection to Bakugou. Odd as it was, his actions were more open and less skittish when the boy was around. Shouta watched as Bakugou made his way straight for the other boy, not even acknowledging his teacher's presence. Midoriya unfurled himself, letting his legs hang off the sill as Bakugou got to him, raising hands slowly. The way Midoriya's eyes followed the blonde's hand had Shouta noticing for the thousandth time the similarity Midoriya had with a cat. It was odd, to say the least. Bakugou took a strand of Midoriya's curls and rubbed them between his fingers. Better, he grumbled. Still needs a fucking cut. That Shouta could agree with. The boy's hair was definitely better clean and unmatted. But damn it, was a blush. Shouta and his husband enjoyed their long hair, but Midoriya's was just unruly. Still, Shouta raised an eyebrow at his student's antics when he turned to greet him. Fucking what? He growled. Nothing. Shouta answered innocently, hiding a smirk and a scarf. He knew Bakugou tended to mother-hen his friends, but he was on another level with Midoriya. The boy hopped off the windowsill, and Bakugou scoffed at his appearance, shooting Shouta an unamused look. Midoriya really did look ridiculous. The dark pants were rolled up multiple times, and still one trailed under his knee. He didn't even put on shoes, but Shouta had decided not to question it until they had to leave the hospital. He also hadn't rolled up his sleeves, so they hung at ridiculous lengths over his hands, one side of the jumper falling off his shoulder, showing his bandages. Shouta shrugged helplessly. There's a reason I don't do the shopping. Fucking clearly. The blonde scoffed, though was slightly distracted as he was manhandled to turn in a circle. Shouta had to resist a laugh as he watched Midoriya turn his student around, pulling at the arms and clothes. There was something that would have to teach the boy. Personal boundaries seemed to be a huge issue when it came to Midoriya's own. Unpredicted touches and fast or loud movements caused him to flinch or rebel violently in some ways. As soon as it came to someone else's space, however, Bakugou's in particular, all restraint was thrown out the window. Kami, what, Izuku? Bakugou asked as he was spun in his fifth circle. Midoriya didn't answer him straight away, simply stepping back slightly and circling before stopping with his back to the door. The same, he said after a minute. Huh? Midoriya tilted his head and blinked slowly, like a goddamn cat. Shouta could swear it was a kid's quirk. Clothes. They're the same as yesterday's. Bakugou glanced at Shouta, who schooled his expression to hide his amusement. Yeah, it's my uniform for school? Bakugou hummed slightly before turning his curious gaze on Shouta. Shouta spoke before the kid felt the need to investigate. Hero costume. Kind of a uniform. I don't wear it all the time, but I have a lot of dark clothes. He explained. Izuku just continued to stare at him. When he looked as though he was going to say something else, the door opened again. All three heads turned toward the newcomer, Tsukauchi stepping in first, followed by the green-haired woman that had seen with Bakugou plenty of times. The similarities between the mother and son were uncanny. Apart from the damages Izuku had faced, the stretch of silence was almost unbearable, as the two Midoriyas stared at each other. Slowly, however, the elder's eyes began to water as she shook her head lifting to her mouth. No, she whispered, surprising the room. No, 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 that is, no, no. Bakugou took a slight step forward, standing just behind the younger Midoriya, face etched with concern and confusion. Both him and Tsukauchi spoke at the same time. Miss Midoriya? Auntie, you alright? Miss Midoriya was still mumbling slightly to herself, tears flowing, stumbling over her words. Auntie, it's Izuku, it's your son. Bakugou tried again, only to be interrupted harshly by Miss Midoriya. No, Katsuki! I know how you missed my Izuku, but that's... she said, voice shaking as she pointed an accusatory finger at Izuku. That is not my son! If Bakugou thought he was shocked before, these words will forever be burned into his memory. Auntie! I'm sorry. I need to go. I'm sorry, she said as she stumbled out the door. Bakugou went to follow, but Shouta put a hand on his chest as Tsukauchi went for the door. No, you stay with Midoriya. We will be right back, he said sternly, pushing him back to the young boy. Midoriya's face was blank, but Shouta couldn't get any reading on him, which wasn't unusual but still concerning. Both he and the detective ran after Miss Midoriya. She was near at the reception when they called out for her to stop. Look, I know I must seem like a terrible person to you, but I can't look at that boy in there and pretend he's the same boy I lost 10 years ago, she said before they could ask her anything. Ma'am, we know this must be a difficult situation for you, but... Tsukauchi started. No! She snapped over to him before taking a deep breath. I apologize for my bluntness, detective. Eraserhead. But you couldn't possibly know how difficult this situation is to me. She took a number of calming breaths. When she looked at the two men against her eyes, though still full with tears, were fierce. Do you know the name of Reaper's first victim? She asked them. They shook their heads. Shouta had never thought to look into it, though now he wished he had. His name was Midoriya Hizashi. Both men sucked in harsh breaths. He was overseas in America working at the time. The years before we had accepted our Izuku weren't coming home. She breathed in shakily. I mourned them both at peace with them being gone. I come today to see him. He would change that, but it doesn't. That's not my boy. That boy in there, he's a murderer, a monster, one who killed his own father, and so many more. I don't know. I know. There are so many factors at play here, but I can't. Her voice caught as she brought her hand to her mouth. I can't pretend they're the same. I can't. I'm sorry. I need to go. She stumbled, voice cracking as the tears started again. She took a few steps before turning back to them. Take care of him. Then she was gone, leaving the two dumbstruck men to stare in her wake. There wasn't a lot they could do in this situation. Midoriya Inko, though she wouldn't be staying with Izuku, still wouldn't be able to return to Tokyo due to their connections. They knew she would be upset with the situation. How could one not be? They weren't, however, expecting her to completely abandon the idea of the boy in the hospital room being her son. Did you know about Midoriya Hizashi? Shouta asked after a few minutes of tense silence. The detective swallowed harshly, shaking his head. Shouta hummed slightly. We should head back to the boys. Again, the detective merely nodded. When they got back to the room, the two boys had shut up at their presence. Bakugou stood up from the bed, leaving Midoriya sitting on the edge of it. Shouta could practically see the anger rolling off the blonde in waves. Did she fucking leave? What the fuck did she say? He growled out. The two older men glanced at each other before looking over at Midoriya. Shouta looked back at the student, who he could sense was about to blow up, especially after sensing being ignored. We'll talk about it later, he said, giving Bakugou a stern look when it looked as though he was going to protest. Shouta did not want to explain to Midoriya, right that moment, that his mother didn't want to see him anymore, that she only saw him as a murderer. He especially didn't want to breach the topic of Midoriya killing his father. Sakachi cleared his throat, stepping towards the boys, who sat at the bed. His face was still blank, but there was a lingering sadness in his green eyes, one he couldn't hide. Izuku, are you all right? The detective asked gently. Midoriya blinked at him, confusing flickering for a moment across his face. Pardon? Are you all right? The detective repeated. I know the situation must be upsetting for you. We want to know if you'd like a moment to yourself, or something, before we leave. Oh. Midoriya blinked, thoughtful again. No, I am fine, but the woman, she was my mother. It came out as a question. Ah, yes, she was. Sakachi answered carefully. Do you not remember her? Izuku turned his head, looking thoughtful. Bits and pieces. Green. I remember green, and... He shook his head, schooling his expression again. I didn't mean to upset her. I'm sorry. Everyone in the room was taken aback by his apology. It wasn't the first time he had apologized for believing he had made one of them upset or angry, even when he hadn't. He seemed to believe everything was his fault. Apologizing made it his default setting. It was quite alarming, and definitely something Shouta would have to work with him on. That wasn't you, Shouta said gruffly. His eyes found the clock at the wall, sighing heavily at this time. We'd discuss it more at a later date. Right now, let's get you released. The two older men led the boys down the corridors toward the receptionist. The sudden increase in security was exponentially obvious. Their eyes trained on the group, particularly the green-haired boy. A quick glance back showed Shouta wasn't the only one who noticed. Though Bakugou was scowling at everyone they passed, he wasn't what caught Shota's attention. Midoriya was clearly tense, walking stiffly, eyes trained on the floor. Though Shouta could tell that they were aware of everything around him. His eyes were clenched so tightly into fists, the knuckles were white. Shouta inwardly sighed, leaning the boys to the waiting area. As they sat down, Shouta slowly and carefully tapped the boy's fist. Careful, he grumbled. The boy slowly relaxed his hold, revealing red crescent shapes in his palm. Bakugou hissed sharply, pulling out wipes and a bandage from Kami knows where, and taking the other boy's hand in his. Shouta had to force himself not to laugh at his aggressively caring student. Mother hen. He made his way back to the receptionist where Sakachi was finishing up on the paperwork. Once there, the detective pushed one of the papers towards him. Shouta scowled at the bold writing screaming at him. Parent or guardian signature. Not wanting to think about it much, he signed quickly. handing the papers back to Tsukachi, who handed it back to the receptionist. He pointedly ignored the other man's small smirk, forming on the woman in front of them, especially when she scoffed at the paperwork. Midoriya Izuku. I'm surprised they even allowed his kind to be treated here. She snarled. Shouta furrowed his brows. Yes, having a villain treated in the hospital was unusual, but not unheard of, especially in the hero wing due to his security. Plus Midoriya was a child. They were hardly going to deny him. She barked out a sarcastic laugh. On top of him being a villain? I mean, they should have just thrown him into the depths of Tartarus. One less villain and one less, well, them. Now Shouta was significantly confused. She was clearly annoyed he was a classified villain, for another reason, but he couldn't begin to imagine what the other reason would be. I'm sorry. His kind? He voiced confusion. Villains have been treated here before, as well as assassins. When he glanced at the detective, he was surprised to find him more angry than confused. He cut off whatever the woman was about to say next, her smile dropping instantly at his cold tone. I suggest you think very carefully about what comes out of your mouth next, lest I have you fired for quirkism. The man growled, surprising both the receptionist and Shouta. He didn't think he had ever heard his friend sound so angry. The woman stumbled out an apology, explaining that they were free to go, and a few housekeeping points. As the two men made their way back to the boys, Shouta questioned what the detective meant about her being quirkist. Tsukachi stopped in his tracks, staring at Shouta, a small "oh" forming on his lips. Shit. I never told you about his quirk, did I? He asked. Shouta's eyes widened, realization that, no, he, in fact, still did not know anything, bar his own guesses, about Midoriya's quirk. Grimacing slightly, the detective told him sheepishly. Right. Sorry about that. Must have slipped my mind these days. He steeled himself steadily, glancing at the boy behind him. Midoriya is quirkless. Shouta couldn't have hidden his surprise even if he tried. Then he groaned loudly, rubbing his face. Of course, he had no problem with the boy being quirkless, though it would make his interrogation into society a lot harder. He looked over to the boy in question, who was watching as Bakugou told him something, eyes still flickering around the room, even though they were focused on the boy next to him. Shouta's eyes landed on the still bare feet, and the man groaned again in understanding. Goddamn problem child. She just abandoned her son. Okay, I get it. I can't even blame her because yes, this is the same person who literally killed her own father. But think about it this way. In my sense, if I had a kid that I loved so dearly, that was stripped away from me at a young age, then their father was killed by an assassin. Later down the road, I find out that that assassin is my son, and that judging by the fact that she said, I know that there's like other circumstances, like there's other things in play here, meaning she knew to an extent. My brain would be like, what happened to my loving and caring son, who all they wanted to be was a hero? What happened to them? To have to either become an assassin, to be so heartless and ruthless to become an assassin, or be forced to be an assassin. They were either forced, or they were so heavily manipulated into being an assassin. Either way, I would not blame them for what has happened, because it is not their blame to fault. They are easily moldable. Why do I blame the clay for being a mug, when it was not the clay itself that asked to be molded in such a fashion? Sorry, that triggered me. Clearly, it triggered me. But really, why blame the goddamn clay for being turned to a mug when they did not have the hands to form their body in such a way? It was not Izuku's fault. To insinuate that it is, to insinuate that this is not your boy, I get it. This is not your son. This is not the same boy. But it's still your son. It's not the same one. He's changed. But that's the thing about love. You're supposed to love your person. You're supposed to love the people you love, even though they change. You love them as they change, because you love every single aspect of them, even as they're changing. Sorry. This triggered me. My jaw hurts. I'm actually clenching my jaw so hard. I am so frustrated right now with Inko. I'm so frustrated. So fucking frustrated. Okay. Obviously, Hitoshi was very much, you know, on board with all of this. It makes sense on why he was on board. Not Hizashi, Bakugou was on board with all of this. Shouta was a little touch and go. I love Hizashi being like, you know what, I didn't like it at first, but okay, we're gonna help this kid out. Tsukachi being protective. I love a protective Tsukachi. Love it, love it, love it. I have protective Tsukachi in my fic as well. Slightly. It's heavy mention, not heavy mention, but slight mentions and stuff like that. I might bring Tsukachi back in flashbacks. I know I didn't have that in my original writings, but I'm going to definitely bring it back in flashbacks for Fluffy Mind and stuff. And Hitoshi being scared. I love that they touched upon, you know, personally, even if they didn't say why Hitoshi was not so fond of the idea, I would have come to the conclusion that, yeah, Hitoshi very much is not fond of the idea because, right, this is terrifying. This is something that terrified his dad. He is terrified. What is he terrified? Losing his family. Losing his family. He would rather die than lose his family kind of situation. So, with Inko's situation and all that, whew, okay, so it is confirmed Izuku is probably still quirkless. He probably doesn't have any quirks. I don't have much to say. So, as always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Links to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.